And now for something completely different.
Forget everything you've been told by others before. Get ready for the real deal, the full story. Real talk about money, markets, life. Now, it's The Real Investment Show with Lance Roberts, presented by RIA Advisors.
Good morning, this is Lance Roberts from The Real Investment Show, and welcoming you to our inaugural debut of our interview series on The Real Investment Show with our very special guest, author and economist and editor of RealClearMarkets, John Tamny. John probably won't remember this, but in 2007, I was this kind of young writer, just started writing blogs, and I wrote this article about the economy, and I talked about the importance of production in the economy, and John was kind enough to send me a very terse email correcting me that it is consumption that comes first within the economy, not production. And so, John, that has been taken well to heart. And over these years, I've made sure to reiterate that point many times.
No, I said production. Comes
yeah,
first.
yeah. Sorry, I said it backwards. The production comes first. Yes. See, you corrected me again. Here we go. You probably don't remember that email, but just set a path for me. And I've been a big admirer of yours ever since. And, I wanted to talk to you today about your new book that you've got coming out. Actually, it's out. I should correct that. It came out on July the 8th. You can get it all, Amazon.com, all your favorite booksellers. It's called The Deficit Delusion, Why Everything Left, Right, and Supply Side Tell You About the National Debt is Wrong. And John, I think this is a really kind of key point because this was a recent headline on July the 7th, the day before his book came out, from CNBC, America's Deficit Reckoning, How the U.S. Debt Spiral Could Spark a Crisis. And, John, this has been a big topic of debate, particularly ever since President Trump took office. And, for some reason, the debt and the deficit wasn't a big deal during the last administration, but as soon as Trump's taken office, it's now everywhere. And Ray Dalio, the famous hedge fund manager, talking about the deficit spiral is going to create a major economic crisis. It's scaring the bejeebers out of investors for a variety of reasons. Every time the interest rate on the 10-year ticks up, it's apparently because foreign investors no longer want our debt. It's the debt issue is too big. Nobody wants to own our debt. John, can we just start from kind of the basics of, and we can even start talking kind of about the basics of your book. Let's talk about the debt, the deficit, how it operates in the economy, and kind of go from there. So let's start with the big view, right? So let's start at the top. 37 trillion in debt. That number keeps going up. It's obviously a big number. People are concerned about it. What's your take?
Wow, we must be a prosperous country, an incredibly prosperous country. Because money's ruthless, as you know. Money moves to its highest use. It moves to returns relentlessly. So if we have 37 trillion in debt, that must mean that the rest of the world sees our economic future as not just bright, but blindingly bright.
This is kind of the issue. The economy's growing. We're obviously collecting more tax revenue. And as that revenue comes in, we're looking forward. Now we're talking about AI and we're talking about all these innovations in the economy. One of the issues I think that's important when we take, kind of one of my issues with kind of the mainstream media is they look at the debt as a number, right? It's 37 trillion. Sounds huge. But they don't really look at it in terms of, to your point, the economic growth, the prosperity of the country. And so you have to start taking these things in context. What is the debt relative to the economic growth, the revenue, these type of things? Is that the right way to start looking at this?
Well, of course it is. $1 million in debt would be a lot for me, much less for you. For the United States, it would be microscopic relative to its future tax revenues. And so you have to think of it in terms of that. And to be clear, this is not me defending government spending. This isn't me defending borrowing. It's me saying that the problem we have is that government collects way too much tax revenue now. And even more perilous, it will collect exponentially more in the future from the most productive people on earth. And that's how we know the debt's going to rise. Debt is an effect of the trust of the marketplace in your future incomings. The Treasury's incomings are trusted more than any other entity on earth.
I want to make sure that people understand this because that point is extremely valuable, is that when people are buying the U.S. debt, they're buying into the future prosperity of the company. We kind of think about it in terms of, and you actually wrote in the introduction to your book, I thought it was such a great analogy talking about Uber. And when you think about it this way, when Uber was a burgeoning company just getting started, who's going to get in a stranger with a car, right? I mean, that was such a far-fetched idea that people actually get into strangers' cars and drive around somewhere. But there was belief in that, and they were given money in excess of what they were earning. Basically, they took on debt in order to grow that company because there was a belief that Uber could grow into something larger than it was at the time, and that's certainly been the case. And that's the same thing with the U.S. economy, and that's the takeaway I took from your book is that the expectation of the Treasury, one of the kind of the premises of the U.S. debt is that it's risk-free, right? The government can always pay its debt because they have a printing press and they can just print more money. But the reality is the reason that people buy U.S. Treasuries is because they know that we're going to continue to collect more revenue in the future, and there is an ability to repay that debt in the future because of growing revenues, correct?
Absolutely. But consider that relative to Uber. Uber gave up 20% of itself in 2011 for $12 million. Mm-hmm. Imagine giving up so much for equity. But see, that was its only option. As you know, startups out in Silicon Valley, it's all equity finance because every startup out there fails just about. And so there's not an interest rate high enough to lend to startups in Silicon Valley. There's just no way to compensate lenders for the risk of putting wealth to work with them. And so they had to give up equity to get that money. Now they're worth 180 billion, I think. Mm-hmm. They've got 10 billion, 11 billion in debt. Well, of course they do. Because see, the markets trust their future. Debt is something you graduate to. It's not something that you just, wouldn't we all love to run up debt? No, most of us, when we have ideas, we give up equity in our ideas. Mm.
Do a lot of these takes about U.S. debt, are they, the idea is that, well, you can't run a household like we run the government, but there's a massive difference between households, the way a household operates and the way the government operates. And the other kind of misnomer is, in my opinion, look, and feel free, you corrected me about production already, so we'll just start there. You can correct me if I'm wrong in my assumption, but all the government debt that we take on, it does wind up back in the economy in terms of Social Security payments, welfare payments. It winds, we spend money on defense spending, which winds up with Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and other companies, which gets recycled into payrolls and these type of things. So, one of the, yes, the debt is a big thing. And yes, we're collecting a lot of tax revenue from that. But that debt is also providing for economic growth. The debts and the deficits provide for some economic growth because it winds up, winds up on, households' balance sheets from Social Security payments. Retirees can go out and buy groceries, right?
That's where there'd be some pushback. First of all, households run up debt.
Sure.
And what was your credit card limit when you were 21 versus what is it today? And I'm not saying you run up debt, but the point is Americans are promiscuous borrowers. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they're They're just Herculean producers.
Right.
Houses. Look at the debt people run up when they buy houses. They're paid, but people trust their futures, and so. But as far as to me, but the other thing. Okay, well, the money flows back through the economy. Yeah, that's true. But oh, what a loss.
Oh yeah.
Because as you know, you're an investor, and so you know how ruthless markets are. They're just constantly pushing, starving bad ideas. That's how markets get their strength, is the starvation of bad ideas and feeding the good ones. And that's what I keep trying to say to people. You're focused on the debt. The markets keep telling you that the debt's the easy part. Mm-hmm. What you should be focused on is what we're not doing as a consequence of all this government consumption. I mean, think Social Security alone. You and I could do a show about that, but oh my gosh, if people just own their own retirement rather than this, which is basically government taking, essentially adding to our income tax, spending it right away. There's no lockbox or anything like that. And then it's always been known general revenues would eventually fund Social Security as is. So what are we losing in terms of our own wealth, but in terms of progress?
You know, when we're talking about the money, and you actually said this, which is when the money winds up back on the balance sheet of the household, right? It comes in at a loss. And there was a study by Jones and DeRuggie over at George Marcus University, and they looked at the multiplier effect of recycled tax dollars. Basically, collect tax dollars, goes in, you pay your Social Security taxes, then it winds up back on Social Security payments, right? So recycling tax dollars. They found out that there was a rather severe negative multiplier effect of that. That's to your point, that that money winds up back on the balance sheet as a loss. And one of the things that we've done very poorly is using debts and deficits to create productive investments. There's a really great book I read a while back by Dr. Woody Brock. He wrote this book called American Gridlock, talking specifically about this. And he said, look, he says, debt's not a bad thing. If you use debt, so if country A spends $4 trillion with the receipts of $3 trillion, sounds like the U.S., that leaves country A with a $1 trillion deficit. And to make up that difference in spending income, the Treasury has to issue another $1 trillion. But if country B spends $4 trillion, collects $3 trillion in income, but that extra $1 trillion isn't a productive investment, say like the Hoover Dam or Tennessee River Valley Authority, things that we used to do, and it creates revenue, it pays for itself over time. And so the multiplier effect of that in the economy, that use of debt becomes much stronger in the economy. And that's and one of the things that we've done very poorly, in the last 40 years, when, because you go back to Reagan, we weren't running that big of a debt and that big of a deficit, right? And so it's just kind of gotten progressively worse. Economic growth has slowed, over the last 40 years because it's been this continuation of non-productive use of investment, which is to your point, the use of capital is eroding economic stability. And so how do you start thinking, when you start thinking about these things, how do you start, getting government, right? The people in politics to start understanding that the debt isn't the problem, it's the use of it?
I'll first say the surest sign we've had enormous economic growth in the last 40 years is all the debt. There's just no, and so that's why I rebutted very nicely Greg Mankiw's. He says economic growth could get us out. That's one way to get us out of the debt. No. We've had that. Federal debt in 1980 total was $900 billion. As we speak, it's $37 trillion. It's up 41 times since 1980. What does that tell you? We've had just staggering amounts of economic growth, people getting richer and richer, and and government's taxable access to soaring amounts of wealth, enabling lots of borrowing. And so there's no good uses of government spending. I mean, I'm sorry, the Hoover Dam, sure, you got me there, but
it's such a rare occurrence if that happens.
But Disney builds roads in Orlando because it needs to get its people around. I mean, so I'm not going to fight you on roads, and I'm not going to fight you on Hoover Dam, but going back to Silicon Valley again, most ideas die in the private sector, and that's a source for our dynamism. Bad ideas never die in government, and so there's rarely a good use of debt. And so it's people say, well, wait a second, you're saying deficits don't matter. Well, I am, while also saying government spending is the true tax. It's the worst tax of all on the American people and on the world, I would add.
Right. Well, and again, to your point, I was actually going to get to your article that you just posted at RealClearMarkets, I believe yesterday. You posted it, talking about Greg Mankiw and kind of the federal debt. This is the opening statement. The federal debt will soar in the coming decades. The previous truth can be found in the monolithic nature of the proposed debt solutions, and that's really kind of where I wanted to get to with this conversation. Is we can think about productive investments, right? So we got all this AI. We need to rebuild the entire power grid of the U.S. to support AI. there's a potential public-private partnership there that we could create, a lot of jobs and activity in the economy, rebuilding the power grid. But that's those type of ideas that never make it through Congress. Greg said that, to your point in the article, is that we can grow our way out of this, and you push back well on that, saying it's not surprising whether it's individuals, businesses, or governments. The capacity to borrow is an effect of market confidence in the incomings of the present, but much more importantly, expectations of future incomings. In other words, the U.S. has lots of debts, not because of the Treasury, but because that hasn't collected enough tax revenue, but because there's this expectation of growth in the future. So when we talk about this, one of the kind of the common narratives of the mainstream economists is, the government's just printing money. We're just printing money like crazy because we're issuing debt. And this is where, and again, we Elon Musk went into government, tried with Doge to cut spending. That was, I don't know if you can call it a complete failure, but it certainly wasn't the success that many anticipated. Why is that happening?
Because it doesn't address why we have debt. Let's say Musk cut $2 trillion. It would have been a success if the government had promised to burn the money. But otherwise, he would have just given Congress $2 trillion worth of powder to try new ideas. No act of government spending cuts ever shrink government. They just shrink the waste to something else. And that's what's so dangerous. Medicare began as a $3 billion program. It's about to be a $1 trillion program. Mm-hmm. The danger of spending cuts is it's not just that they never happen. And that's almost a good thing. If they happen, you'll give these guys all sorts of room to fund new, really bad ideas. And so I argue in my book, I say, whatever you do, don't let them reform Social Security or Medicare. Not because I think they're good programs. I think they're ridiculously awful programs. But the two of them are containing a lot of government waste. If you reform them, you give Congress all sorts of money to try new things. I don't want that. Mm-hmm. Government spending is bad. If anyone doubts it, look at West Virginia. It has taken in copious amounts of federal money for decades, and that's why it's still poor. California is the richest place on earth. It would be exponentially richer if it didn't have so much waste. And so my point is always, don't reform something. Focus on why there's debt in the first place. It's too much tax revenue and the expectation of much more. Until the various economic religions grasp that, government debt's going to continue to grow because investors are ruthless. And investors put their money where it can get a return. And there are no safer returns, as you allude, than the U.S. Treasury.
So this kind of brings us to the big debate, right? Is, okay, so we're collecting too much in tax revenue. Can we cut taxes? What are the beginnings of solution here in order to potentially fix that problem? Or is it just an unfixable problem at this point? And particularly with the way Congress is structured and the way that it operates, is it just the way it's going to be?
Well, you make a good point. Theoretically, it's an unfixable problem. Is Congress is never going to give up the revenues. And Congress loves the idea. But, let's put the Laffer curve, and I love Arthur Laffer, but let's put it, Laffer never intended its use this way in the first place. Let's put it in the ash heap of history. The problem, the goal should not be about maximizing tax revenue. Let's put the flat tax in bed. Let's also put a consumption tax in bed, because all of these ensure massive surges of revenue in the future, simply because the American capacity to create wealth is unceasing, and it's going to be greater and greater. And so people say, well, if we just had a flat tax of 10%, well, 10% of the future wealth creation in this country is enormous. And it will feed ever more spending and borrowing, precisely because if you buy treasuries, they'll be the safest bet on earth. And so there's got to be a discussion, not of GDP and debt charts and all this, there's got to be a discussion. What are we not doing because of all this consumption of precious wealth? I'll give one example. Are you still in Houston?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so there was a running joke back in Houston in the early days of air conditioning, that Houstonians who didn't own air conditioning in their cars would drive with their windows up despite, so that people didn't think they were too poor to own an air conditioner.
That's correct.
Along these lines, there was a rich Houstonian businessman. Oh, I mean, you just love this guy. He had hay fever, and the summers were awful for him. But he had some money. And so he bought an air conditioner and powered it with gasoline to feed his car so he could drive around. Now, my point in this is air conditioning was discovered in the early 1900s, but it did not reach mass usage until realistically the 1980s. Mm-hmm. Think of all the suffering that had to take place. And let's add the death, the endless deaths that happened because of heat. And then we figured out a way to mitigate it. What if government hadn't been consuming so much wealth? And let's ask the question now, what maladies, what discomforts are we not solving in 2025? Because government consumes, what, 6-7 trillion a year?
Yeah.
It's staggering. And so you got to make the argument in those terms. We must reduce the tax burdens on the Elon Musk in the world so low that they're paying the same as John Tamny, because that's the only way to limit government, but it's also the only way to seriously drive progress. Mm-hmm. And let's look at it in happy terms. Air conditioning, other amazing advances, mass advances that will transform our lives. Mm-hmm. Let's make it an optimistic argument instead of this loser, deficit, disaster argument that they've been making for decades, that until we do something about this, oh boy, it's going to really get ugly. This is global warming for the right.
That's a great way.
Endless alarmism that markets have been mocking for decades.
Yeah. I guess the question then becomes okay, let's just say that you're now the dictator of the U.S., for lack of a better term. What's the solution to this? I mean, the debt and the deficit is an alarming problem according to all the media. But how do you start fixing the debt and the deficit problem? What would be the end run to do that, considering that there is an impact on economic activity from the debt that we issue? I mean, if you took away the debt, if we were running no debt, we would have negative economic growth.
No, we would have negative GDP growth.
Well, this is correct.
But GDP is a fraudulent number. It's much more fraudulent. It's the most fraudulent number in economics that actually says government spending increases economic growth. No, government spending is an effect of economic growth. To say that it adds to economic growth is double counting.
Okay. And
so if you actually did greatly reduce the federal spending footprint, forgetting about deficits or anything like that, the economic growth would be staggering, because suddenly trillions that are being wasted would be finding their ways to future Elon Musk's and future Jeff Bezos's. I mean, the unseen with all this waste is really awe-inspiring, and it's really sad. We would be so much more advanced if all this weren't being consumed. So if you made me dictator, I would say, oh, this is simple. Elon Musk doesn't owe more taxes than John Tamny. And watch how suddenly the willingness to lend to the U.S. Treasury declines substantially. No one lends because they just people lend to family members whom they pity or whom they love. Mm-hmm. No one lends to some stranger this way unless they know they're going to be paid back.
Right. And that's why I don't lend to my kids.
Yeah. But Lance, is true. You're a socialist with your kids, but you're not a socialist with
that's right.
Others.
Right. In business, absolutely not. With my kids, yes. Yeah. No, absolutely right.
Of course you. Yeah, you're a human being. But that's the idea. We want to keep that local. We want to keep the socialist choices local. And then as government gets farther from us, we want to reduce the tax burden, their tax take. Strangely, our side has reversed it. They actually want to have most of the taxation be federal. I'll never understand that. They revel in all this zero tax. I wish all the states would do most of the taxation. We could credit it against federal, but no one agrees with me.
The left calls for tax increases. Back in 2020, we did this whole kind of modern monetary theory experiment where we sent checks to households. And, modern monetary theory says that you can send all the money you want to households, it's fine. And then we get inflation, you have to raise taxes to limit the spending, right? And that's their theory. And of course, we got the inflation, but nobody raised taxes. So we've got the left says, hey, we need to raise taxes. The right say we need to cut taxes. What's right here? Where does this actually, what's the right tax rate? If you wanted to establish a tax rate that would create economic growth, is it 10%? I mean, is it kind of that flat tax idea?
No, I don't think so. We already grow enormously. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying, of course we could grow more. I'm saying the best tax rate is one that massively reduces revenues. I don't know what that is. Okay. And neither side wants to try it. And sadly, no one wants to have the discussion because there's this view, well, if we reduce tax revenues, the deficit will balloon, which is just so backwards. Again, have you ever known an individual or a business that can borrow more and more the less they're taking in? Right. I mean, money is so ruthless. Again, use the Uber example. Use NVIDIA. NVIDIA nearly died for so long it couldn't get any money. And a bank loan, are you kidding? No one was going to touch it with a bank loan because there wasn't an interest rate high enough to lend to it. Money is cruel, and that's the way it should be. If we actually were to set about reducing federal revenue, rest assured that markets would respond to that. And they'd say, Treasury's not as good of a bet as it was in the past. There's an intent on the American people to actually reduce the tax burden on the most productive. And you would see the debt go down. But instead, you have this monolithic debate. No one, left, right, supply side, libertarian, they all come to the same wrong-headed, just utterly dense conclusion that the way to fix this is to increase government revenue. It's as though none of these people have ever been in the private sector, and worse, they've never even bothered to look at the private sector.
By the way, we're talking with John Tamny. He's the author of a new book just came out on July the 7th, talk about the deficit delusion, why everything left, right, and supply side tell you is wrong about the national debt. And John, in that book, right in the introduction, you just kind of go through several really good examples. We talked about Uber already, but the same thing with Amazon, the same thing with a host of other companies that have been through the same type of startup process that have grown their businesses. They're massively successful. And to your point, if they didn't have a successful business, nobody would loan them money because, again, if you can't pay me back, I'm not going to loan you money. And that's kind of your argument here, is that if we were reducing the revenue to the government, then that would create more private sector activity because they would be more reliant on each other rather than on the government. Is that a kind of a good synopsis?
Well, yeah, but I don't even think they're relying on the government now. There would just be more money finding its way to good ideas. Mm-hmm. And let's add, there'd be more money finding its way to crazy ideas. What is the theme of Silicon Valley? It's people who are borderline crazy, just complete nut jobs. I want to fund the nut jobs.
That's how we wound up with Skynet eventually. So,
but you look back to remember the AIDS crisis,
right?
And the conventional wisdom was, oh man, Ronald Reagan's he's got to spend more. And the free thinkers were saying, have you lost your mind? If you want every whack job out there working to come up with a real fix. You don't want just this narrow approach from government. You want it expansive. And so one thing we know about entrepreneurs is they're not entrepreneurs by choice. It's a state of mind. It's someone who's so weird as to think the way everything's being done now is completely 100% wrong. Let's never forget, Jeff Bezos was ridiculed for the longest time before he was taken seriously. Because, oh gosh, they can never make a profit and all. I want government taking in less and consuming less because I want exponentially more Jeff Bezoses and Elon Musk's. But you can't have that in the present scenario, and you can't simply because so much of the wealth that's being created is being taxed away. I just think we could have many more if we weren't taxing it so much.
This is always the argument of the household, right? Which is I could do so many more things if I wasn't paying 50% of my money in taxes, because I'm taxed on everything. I have my 33% income tax, well, depending on your tax bracket, but I've got my 33% income taxes. I've got my sales tax. I've got my property tax, my this tax, that tax. And you actually start adding all this up, half your income, more in some cases, if you live in California, goes to taxes, which is money you can't spend on, buying a bigger house, buying a better car, whatever it is that you want to pay with. And this has been a long argument of individuals. And this is why, individuals always favor tax cuts for the simple reason, like, oh, you're going to give me a tax cut? Great. That gives me more money to spend at home.
Yeah. And I would just add to that. I think we agree that investment is the sole driver of economic growth. Consumption is the effect of investment because investment drives production and that enables it. And so think about what this means with the richest people. They've fulfilled all their needs. And so when you give them a cut, they have no choice but to invest it. And this is something that our side just can't grasp. I'm sorry, but the Trump tax cuts were major tax hikes for rich people, particularly on the coasts. And they literally brag. They say, well, most of the tax cuts went to middle and poor earners. I'm saying, okay, well, if you're going to brag about that, admit that there was no growth in these tax cuts, that whatever growth occurred from 2016 on had nothing to do with your legislation.
Right.
You only get growth from investment. And the more you reduce the burden on those with the most, again, they can only buy so many houses. They have to put it to work.
That statement right there is going to blow the mind for a ton of people who are in that attitude that we need to tax the rich more. The rich need to pay their fair share. We've heard those arguments endlessly. That they don't pay enough in taxes. They get all these extra benefits because they're rich, et cetera. And there's so much fallacy to that. But again, and this is to your point, they've also created, Elon Musk has created multiple businesses. He's employed people, created economic activity within the economy. And yeah, he may not pay as much. Of course, he's paid a lot in taxes too. He paid $11 billion in 1 year in taxes, right?
Record levels. And so the answer's always got to be, it's not just that they pay their fair, they pay a massively unfair share, and how it is the debt. There's quite simply no way we would have all this debt if not for the inflows of rich people's taxes now and the expectation in the future. And that's one of the important chapters in my book. Sam Altman and the AI crowd, that they've got a text chain basically where they've placed a bet. In what year from now, how many years from now will be the first one-man unicorn? Think about that. A one-man company worth $1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
And their expectation is that because of these beautiful technological advances, we're not far from it. It's within the next few years.
Mm-hmm.
What does that tell you about future government revenue in the present tax structure? It's going to skyrocket. So you have all these people saying the same thing over and over again. Oh my God, the debt and everything. Markets keep telling them the debt's going to be easy to pay off. It's gotten progressively easier throughout time as wealth has expanded. All the whilst they're focused on the exact thing markets are saying isn't a problem, all the while not focusing on where we could be today if they weren't taking so much from us in the first place. The debt is a signal that we are massively overtaxed. But it's got to be stressed. This is the opposite of the Laffer curve. They keep saying, well, no, let's raise taxes by lowering them. Hey, no argument with it, but it's a really lame argument because it encourages more flows. Mm-hmm. No, we have all this debt because we take in way too much revenue now and well into the future.
We're getting close to ending our conversation with John Tamny, the author of The Deficit Delusion, Why Everything Left, Right, and Supply Side Tells You Is Wrong with the National Debt. John, I wanted to wrap up here with, and I'm going to give you plenty of time to espouse your view. But I love this conclusion that you had in your introduction. It says, without fail, the books on budget deficits, national debt, Ponzi schemes, and unsustainable debt will claim that a debt crisis of mythic proportions awaits us. It's an exaggeration for sure, but not much of an exaggeration that a Rose Bowl or two could be filled up with all the politicians, economists, and pundits who have predicted it in the past and are predicting it now and in the future, a debt crisis. Readers can rest assured they'll find none of that here, and to the extent of the debt crisis will be mentioned in this book, it will mock alarmists in our midst. And that's really kind of the focus of this book, is that it's a very different view. Again, there's so much being written right now, and again, for me, look, I really don't have a dog in this hunt, right? I'm a money manager. I manage client assets, and the biggest thing I fight with my clients is that they come and they're terrified. Right? It's like, Lance, I'm so scared about my financial future because I just read this article on CNBC. There's going to be a debt crisis and it's going to wipe everything out and I'm going to lose all my money. And, I've written a lot of articles and things saying, hey, the debt crisis isn't the thing to worry about. And we've gone, we've looked back at history. To your point, we've had these repeated arguments. Ray Dalio was predicting a depression in 1982. And it hasn't happened yet. And so so I want to just kind of shift our focus here just as we get ready to conclude to just individuals out there listening to this podcast. They've got money invested in the markets. They're hearing all these things about the debt crisis, the deficit. It's all going to end badly, and it's going to end badly in my lifetime. It's inevitable. In fact, it's going to probably be next year, according to a lot of the media. Your view is that's not really the case, and it's not going to be the case because of economic prosperity.
Yeah, no, my view is that you should buy my book for all those clients who are worried.
I'll be happy to do that, by the way.
Some people will take this the wrong way, but you put it well. All the debt is why Americans should stay invested. Hear me out. Stay invested in stocks and everything. It's a signal, once again, of the intense optimism of the marketplace for the American future. No country can run up that kind of debt unless the expectation is that the people within that country are going to create ever more innovative concepts that transform how we live.
John, it's a great point, and I love the conclusion in your introduction into your book, which is the deficit delusion: Why Everything Left, Right, and Supply Side Tells You Is Wrong About the National Debt. That book is available now on Amazon and all your favorite bookstores. Without fail, the books on budget deficits, national debt, Ponzi schemes, and unsustainable debt will claim that a debt crisis of mythic proportions awaits us. Now, and this is so true, and it scares my clients who are investing money in the markets. This is all they hear about is this terrible outcome that's going to occur because of the debts and deficit. Your argument is that that's not going to be the case because of the economic prosperity in the economy. And this is kind of the true value of the book, which is looking at the same idea that this notion of unsustainability is not true unless economic growth itself is unsustainable. But that's not been the case in the history of the U.S., nor is it the case now. We continue to grow. We continue to be the most prosperous country on the planet. Yes, we have our flaws, no doubt about that, but certainly continuing to grow and prosper, and the advent of AI and potentially what's coming is only going to increase that prosperity. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been a great conversation, and I can't wait for our listeners to hear our inaugural podcast interview with John Tamny. Again, he's the author of The Deficit Delusion, Why Everything Left, Right, and Supply Side Will Tell You Is Wrong About the National Debt. Get a copy of it, read it. It's a very different view than what the mainstream media has been producing, and at least gives you a better concept of what debts and deficits are and how that potentially it's the economic growth itself and the revenues we collect that is more of the problem than not. So again, get a copy of the book. And John, thank you so much for your time today. And we'll definitely have you back here on the show. And again, make sure and read John. He publishes about once a week on RealClearMarkets. Always great articles at RealClearMarkets. Very different insights into the world of economics. And again, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time on the next interview edition of The Real Investment Show.